Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today and share the Dharma with everyone on a very hot July 19th, Sunday. And in Zoom, here is there. My here is your here, at least for a little while, and gives a new spin on interbeing interdependence. I'm continuing my talks on the Lotus Sutra because of the nature of these Zoom meetings. I'm speaking more about the underlying teachings in the sutra than I'm speaking about actual events and stories in the sutra. And I'm doing this because I think it will be helpful for anyone who goes on to read the sutra itself. They'll be aware of what to look for. For others who might be less interested, my talk will focus on some Buddhist teachings that may be of interest and hopefully applicable to everyday life. Simply narrating the stories in the sutra would take too much time, and I've been conducting a series of talks on the Lotus Sutra since last year, actually. But what I want to do is really to get to the heart of the matter, which is where Buddha Dharma, Buddhist teaching, leads. And that's seeing how we can recognize and reduce our suffering, our confusion, our distress. Last time, besides filling in some basic teachings, I talked about attachment, which concerns the things that we hold on to both consciously and unconsciously, but mostly unconsciously, throughout many levels of the mind. Even if we are aware of our attachments or obsessions, it often doesn't matter because they can get the best of us. We have to work hard to change our patterns of behaviors, our views. Think of the problem of addiction. You can be addicted to much more than drugs and alcohol. You can be addicted to points of view, to people, to philosophies, to your fountain pen, anything. Anything will sometimes grab and arrest the mind. So today, I'm going to continue in the same framework as I was talking about attachment, but I'm moving on to non-duality, a very, very important concept in Buddhism. Interestingly enough, in the Lotus Sutra, that phrase is used only once, and it's in the first chapter of the sutra, but it is present in the concept and teaching throughout the sutra, in my opinion. So let me begin by trying to define non-duality. In some ways, non-duality is something like the flip side of attachment. And that's a funny metaphor because non-duality, the experience and the reality of non-duality doesn't have sides, doesn't have a center, doesn't have content. There's nothing to flip. So when I speak or write about it, necessarily, it's a concept. However, from the Buddhist point of view, it's not a concept, but a description of what the process of reality actually is, the reality of reality, so to speak. So it's something beyond words, ideas, language, scripture, yet it's also inclusive of them. Non-duality is the person, the place, the thing, the event itself, but stripped of even those categories. It is how the Buddha and a very enlightened person experiences and relates to the world. Non-dualism can also be understood as boundlessness, limitlessness, and it can be approached with an attitude of tolerance for the inconceivable, a phrase from Robert Thurman. I mentioned that last week. And that's tolerance, not gullibility. This understanding of non-duality does not come from some abstruse philosophy, some esoteric, train of thought. No, it's descriptive, or perhaps it's better to say it is a result or actual meditative experience. It's not the picture of the rice cracker, it's the rice cracker itself. And actually, the rice cracker picture gets a free ride as well, because nothing is excluded. The only way to approach this rather baffling subject is to talk about duality. Duality, by the way, is not the opposite of non-duality. It's more like a subset. That's not entirely accurate, but it will have to do for now. So let's talk about duality. And when we're talking about duality, we're talking about our world, the world of us ordinary sentient beings with all of our issues and our hopes and our dreams and our problems. It's all in this world of duality. So it's the world of categories, opinions, likes, dislikes, opposites, centers, any kind of mind-generated activity. And I'm talking about the kind of mind that we ordinary sentient beings have. This includes our experience of our bodies, our feelings, our perceptions, our desires and dislikes, and consciousness itself. We talk and name things and categories in such a way that we don't even notice how we're doing it, and we attach names to the categories, and then we categorize those categories. We really tend to be unaware of the whole process. So I have two volunteers that you may recognize. Well, one is the famous Teddy Fred, please take a bow. And so I brought in some new personnel. This is Fluffy the bunny. Now, if you observe them carefully on the screen, you will perhaps think that there are three beings here, one sentient and two non-sentient. Hard to tell which is which, right? But what you're perceiving right now on your screens are just pixels, right? Which are not particularly sentient, right? You're just looking at your screen and you're seeing the light waves that are bouncing off me, going into the camera on my laptop and traveling through cyberspace, and there you are. So first of all, you don't like being called non-sentient, do you? Right, you? So, you know, we have to deal with various beings and their sensibilities and, of course, their point of view. Thank you for your help. Okay. So, this reminds me of a story about that's told in Zhuangzi. That's the 4th century BCE Chinese philosopher. And once upon a time, he dreamed that he was a butterfly. And when he woke up from that moment going onward, he was never quite certain whether he was a Chinese philosopher dreaming he was a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming he was a Chinese philosopher. So this, these boundaries of what we think is real and what we think is unreal, they can be bent in certain ways. So some more examples. We're going to have a lot of examples of categorizing in this talk. So here I have a mug, and a cup. Right. So now, all right, I got to get this straight with the reverse. This is like looking into a mirror, which is a very good Buddhist metaphor. So these are recognizable, I think, by most people. And this one is, we would probably call a cup, and this one we would call a mug. But what is it about this? Where is the mugginess? Where is the cuppiness? How much would one have to change for you to call it a mug? How much would one have to change for you to call it a cup? Now, either one of these is designed to be picked up by the handle. But what significance would that have for a cat? To a cat, a handle would have no utility. if the mug or cup was filled with a hot liquid, you would, most of us would have to use the handle to pick up the cup. And this is really the heart of our subjectivity. We look at all these parts, and we're going to look at this a little bit more later. But we categorize things. We look at things, we instantly recognize what it is that we're looking at, and we have a take on it. We have opinions, and mind proliferates from these experiences. And this is kind of pointing to the heart of our subjectivity, the heart of duality. And as I said, we'll get back to this a little later. We see things from one side only. So, and we're consumed and fixated on the functionality of things. So a friend of mine once remarked that highways would be an abomination if we didn't have to drive on them, but we need cars. I'm not putting down cars, but I'm just saying that if we didn't have cars, we would look, in certain cases, we would look at highways in an entirely different way than we look at them now. So now I want to introduce a discipline that is common to philosophy, mathematical logic, and linguistics. It's called mirology. That is MEREOLOGY. I guess it's a somewhat out of the way word, but it is the study of the relationship between the whole and the part. So let's bring up the mug again. So we look at the mug and we can kind of see that it has parts, right? It wouldn't. Now, if you look at just the handle, you can ask the question, well, is the handle the mug? You would say no. But, and if you remove the handle, this would still function as a mug. You could still drink from it. And of course, a cat wouldn't care. But if you remove the bottom, I mean, you can't see the bottom right now, right? It would still look very much like a mug, but the mug functionality would be removed. And if there were no sides, which may have happened to some of you, or it's happened to me, when you drop a mug and basically you have just a handle and the bottom, then it's hardly a mug at all. It's kind of a former mug. And we would tend to look at it as, in that case, as being broken. And we would be fixated on what it was as opposed to what it was in its new state of being. So now just talking more about mirology. So let's say you have a plate and a knife, a fork on the table. So that we would normally call a place or a table setting. Where does that table setting exist, actually? We have three objects, right? But we have some overarching term to categorize their configuration. It's pretty flexible. The knife can be 1 or 2 inches from the plate, but when you start to eat, what happens to the setting? If two people shake hands, do they form a unity? Which is quite a question in this pandemic. And when they stop shaking hands, do they become parts of a former whole? And what happens to my fist when I open my hand? Do fists exist or are they made? So is a fist a noun or a verb? Where do we separate language from reality? This domination of language is a mirror of the domination of the way we think and the way we try to order the world according to our particular views. So this is remarkably apropos to the Lotus Sutra. Now, some people who might be tuning in for the first part really haven't heard any of the parables or the stories, but one very central theme is about that of the great vehicle. And that is a teaching which is ineffable, which is the entirety of the Buddha's wisdom beyond us ordinary sentient beings. And that is coming in to seemingly replace the earlier teachings, which are divided into three. I'm not going to go into the details of exactly how they are, but they're earlier teachings. And they're called vehicles because they convey one from this world of suffering to the to nirvana. That's, you know, a traditional classic interpretation. I'm not saying that's the Chan interpretation, but that's where we're working. So this Lotus Sutra is bringing these revolutionary teachings to the fore. So we have this issue once again of parts and whole. Scholars have debated this for centuries. Are these three separate things somehow contained in the great vehicle? Are they then different when they are in the great vehicle? Is the great vehicle yet a fourth? There we go. A fourth vehicle, right? Well, there can be no answer to this. This is, once again, because what we're really talking about is non-dualism. That is an enormous component of what these teachings are. So we can't categorize them, we can't enumerate them, we can't think about them in any ways that we're normally used to in thinking about what we encounter. So it's undefinable, and this undefinableness is made very clear in the second chapter of the sutra, which is called Expedient Means, where it states very clearly about the vastness of the Buddha's knowledge and how we can only understand this in dribs and drabs and only peripherally by parables and stories and metaphors, various things that will reach us on the level where we are. So wherever we are, whatever our understanding is, there is some part of the teaching that is accessible. And that is kind of the message of the Lotus Sutra, the parts, the whole, indistinguishable. So this reminds me, there's a quote from William Blake, the Romantic poet, who said in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, "The roaring of lions, the howling of wolves, the raging of the stormy sea, and the destructive sword are portions of eternity too great for the eye of man." He's being honest. He wasn't a Buddha, but this is what we're faced with. And I often quote Merleau-Ponty talking about how we're always working with more information than we actually have. Can't say that enough. So now we're going to diving further into this. Another kind of out of the way term, which is called orthogonality. That's orthogonality. And this is another kind of subset of mathematical inquiry, and it's about logical hierarchy. It's much more complicated. There are formulas and algorithms that express this, but I used to be a systems analyst, so I'm using my simple knowledge of this term. So here is an example of how it works. Someone asks me to name 4 countries. So I say Spain, Chile, Japan, and Europe. So when I give those items, that list, what I've done is made a mistake in orthogonality. Europe is a continent, it's not a country. So it contains countries, but it's not a country itself. But then again, it's sort of a country. It's more a country than a bowl of hot chili peppers. It couldn't exist as a category above countries. It couldn't be an organizing categories if there were no such things as countries themselves. So, but now if I expand this orthogonal kind of viewpoint, and I'm asked to name 4 things on the earth, then when I say Spain, Chile, Japan, and Europe, well, my answer is correct, because they certainly are a subset in a certain way. So then you keep expanding until what category can you finally arrive at? Well, what would it be but the universe itself? So compare the universe with this apple, right? Now, right now, I would say that this apple is much more real to you than the universe, because when you say the universe, what is actually in your mind? It's really a concept. I doubt any of us are really beholding the entirety of the universe at this moment. So maybe the universe is contained in the apple. And there are sutras that actually point in that direction. So Carl Sagan once said that if you want to bake an apple pie, using our friend the apple, the first thing that you have to do is create the universe, right? Because no universe, no planets, no land, no trees, there would be no apples, on and on and on. You can extrapolate endlessly. So we also talk about comparing apples and oranges. Now this, are you an orange? This was all I had. So, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, but you'll be an okay stand-in. So when we compare apples and oranges, or apples and lemons, that's a common phrase about our categorization. If we ask the lemon, what kind of an apple are you? The lemon is understandably clueless. And if we ask the apple, what kind of a lemon are you? More cluelessness. So, but if we say, what kind of fruit is this? Then there's a lot we could say about it. We could talk about the colors. We could talk about the shape. We could talk about the acid content, the taste, on and on. So categories get in the way, but they're necessary, obviously, right? So if someone asked you to bring home some fruit and you brought home a carburetor and a wrench, you'd have a pretty inedible fruit salad. So, you know, we can see that's an obviously extreme example, but people have very different views about what they're perceiving and how they're categorizing it. So Archimedes said, give me a place to stand and a lever long enough and I can move the world. So non-dualism is the ultimate leverage because there's no leverage at all. There is no resistance to that which is contained within and without everything. So another example of this from Master Sheng Yen. In one of his books, he spoke about Alaska, how it once belonged to Russia and now it belongs to the US. Did its borderline and shores actually change? Not from the sale of the country, from one country to the other. Only the concepts changed. But then look what happened. The social realities changed a great deal. The culture now is American, for better or worse, not Russian. And seemingly illusory categories have enormous impact. Another example is a story of, it's quite a cute story about a physics student who is in a large lecture hall listening to his professor drone on and on about stars and their life cycle. And he's falling asleep as the professor speaks. And he hears from one little part of his mind that the professor saying, and in 5 billion years, our sun will turn into a supernova, then into a red dwarf, and then collapse into a singularity, a black hole, and all life as we know it will perish. So the student wakes up and raises his hand. He's very, very upset. And he calls out to the professor and he says, "Did you say that the world is going to end in 5 million years? And the professor says, "No, I said 5 billion. And the student goes, "Whew, that was close." And, you know, we grasp things. We circumscribe our world with these views, how numbers and places and people and their associations, how they appear to us, something we really grasp upon. So duality could be another word for attachment, as I'm hope to show. So I'm actually really expanding on my topic from last week. Duality, according to Buddhist teaching, describes the world that we ordinary beings live in. This is a world of delusion. So someone listening who hears this might understandably say, wait a minute, you're saying that I live in delusion? I'm wide awake, aware of my surrounding, aware of who I am, focused, engaged. What do you mean delusion? But this illusory world I'm talking about is made of categories and labels. That is it's second nature to us, sort of almost grafted into our bones. It's not our true nature, but these are things, ways of looking at the world that are imprinted, conditioned, educated into us, and very unstable according to the important Buddhist teaching of impermanence. Everything we encounter is a composite of many things and much effort, yet we apply very limited and limiting concepts to what we encounter in the world, and we hang on for dear life, lest anyone try to deny our take on the world. This delusion and illusion is also very powerful. It organizes individuals into racists or people trying to stop racism or continue to prolong global warming or to impede and stop it. It organizes groups into nations, and nations sometimes into alliances and sometimes driven to war. Such awesome power based on illusory, impermanent blips in our mind. Rather remarkable. So when I spoke of the mug, bringing back our friend the mug, I didn't speak about the material it was made from, the porcelain or the glaze or the technology that was developed so that it could be formed the way it is, and which took probably centuries, and the effort that went into making it and all the people who supported it. Our insistence on seeing a world in black and white with a few grays here and there also misses the causes and conditions that makes things composite. So there's more than materiality to this mug. And if you recognize the presence of the elements, another Buddhist Asian breakdown of apparent reality, that is earth, water, air, fire, space, and consciousness. These show a physical basis for how we're a part of everything and everything is a part of us. Just a word about the 4 elements, which I assume most people have heard about. It's an unfortunate word, element. And in Chinese, it's Si Da, meaning the 4 greats. And it doesn't mean elements like sodium or carbon. It's really about states of matter, in their various forms, and of course energy. And remember, there's also space and consciousness considered part of the elements. Now, here, this is quite interesting. So if I have this mug, so which we would say has the element of solidity of earth, probably made with water, there is air inside of it, and there was fire that caused it to mold, to form. But there's also, it couldn't be a mug if there weren't space for the mug to exist in. Also, in terms of consciousness, we are aware of the mug. So if I move the mug from here to there, it's now a different mug. Now, obviously, it doesn't appear that way to us. But according to these principles, it's changed in space, and our mind has moved to another place. We have different thoughts, different perceptions, different sensibilities. And when I move it back to where it was, it's not like it goes back to its original form. It's different again. Now, this is not the way we ordinarily perceive things, but it shows that, as I said, that we're a part of everything. Everything is a part of us, and our perceptions are more determined, have more determinants than we're generally aware of. If you buy into this particular narrative, this is the claim. And as Heraclitus said, you can't step into the same river twice. And it doesn't have to be a river. It can be a mug, right? But with a river, it's more obvious because you can see it flowing all the time. But the atoms and the molecules are moving all the time in whatever kind of materiality we perceive. So we tend to see things as permanent. We don't acknowledge that. We don't have an understanding that we're even making that assumption. But the Buddhist narrative is that is the way that our minds work, that we're caught in concepts and we're not seeing reality. Reality sort of moves, if you will. I don't know if it's linear or circular, but it is what it is. But our minds are all over the place, sometimes observing this real movement, sometimes not. So our ordinary experience is fraught with duality. Let's look at the levels of duality we are enthralled to. We segment the world into good and bad, yes and no, truth and falsehood, salt and pepper. In addition, if we were to poll everybody listening, we'd get considerable variation on what is good or bad, what to say yes or no to, what's true, what's false, what's too much pepper, too little salt. If we take a broad look at these dualities, we can become aware of some broader categories that trap us, namely the 8 winds. These are teachings in Buddhism, very general criteria which determine how we feel about ourselves, other people, and the world around us. They are success and failure, gain and loss, praise and blame, fame and ill repute. Obviously, we all like the positive ones, success and gain, praise. We also like the negative ones when we can apply them to people we don't like. We could almost say that on a superficial level, these 8 winds constitute the whole of what we consider our lives to be. Sometimes we use these criteria to judge ourselves and sometimes others, and this is a pity because wind is an apt metaphor, the 8 winds. It's always blowing, always changing, impossible to pin, possible to hold onto, and foolish to put a stake in because it's always changing. Another level of duality is about I and other, he and she, us and them. This belongs to me. That group acts in a particular way that I like or don't like. They are utterly separate and distinct from who I think I am. This could also be I and a particular object, like my car, my keys, that other person's diamond ring. These dualistic views are further inflamed by the five poisons of greed, hatred, ignorance, conceit, and envy. Whatever views we have of ourselves, others, or objects, events, situations, they are further distorted by our emotions and passions. And I'm not trying to wipe out emotions or passions, not that I could. What I'm striking is a cautionary note. What we are talking about is what makes us and other people suffer. Obviously, sometimes these things make us happy, just unfortunately doesn't last. And so here we are in a state of stress and uncertainty. So to move away from this kind of dualistic thinking and feeling that I'm talking about is to open up, is to relax, to engage more fully with the world. It's not to constrict yourself within yourself. It might not sound like that, but that is the Buddhist teaching. Another level of duality is subject and object. That could be I and you, but it also comes down to the way our language is structured and how we think about ourselves, others, things, and events. The very way that language has a subject and a predicate inflates duality. I live over here, you live over there. I am angry. Perhaps I am anger. Robert Johnson, the blues singer, once wrote, "I woke up this morning, blues walking like a man." His emotion became the entirety of his identity, or so he felt at a very low point. And then there is the duality between the relative and the absolute. On a scientific level, we know that things are composed of atoms and molecules. Let's call that level the absolute just for a moment. But on a relative level, we don't relate to the world like that. We don't pick up a cell phone or a taco and have any kind of understanding or do we care about how many molecules we are holding to our ear or how many molecules we're about to eat. And atoms and molecules are hardly absolutes because they are composed of smaller and smaller particles. And at subatomic levels, there's a question about whether you're speaking about matter or energy. This isn't just Buddhism, this is Western science. Nothing ultimately fits into our categories. Anyone familiar with Buddhist teachings will start to recognize a very important teaching of the 2nd century CE Buddhist sage Nagarjuna and his two truths. And this is really what we're talking about here. That's it. The two truths is a statement about the absolute and the relative and how they can be distinguishable, but they're not separable, like mountains and valleys. And talking about the two truths could be a whole talk in itself, but I just want to reference that, for people who are, have been really studying this for a long time. It's good to put all of these things together. So on a Buddhist level, the absolute is the world unimpeded by our view of it, a world without fear and prejudice. On the relative level, we rate and categorize everything, and we approve and disapprove of what we have categorized. We get caught in an endless loop of samsara. That is our endless circle of lives and deaths, if you subscribe to that, or just continually reduplicating negative or, let's say, incomplete patterns that don't really let us see through what is troubling us at the deepest level. So we take the products of our mind to be reality, the only reality. This might work if we live forever, but our time is limited. And if we did live forever, we would just be miserable forever without seeing through this. So we're caught up in duality. We don't really notice when the categories are absurd. Is salt the opposite of pepper? Is vanilla the opposite of chocolate? Is American the opposite of foreigner? These seeming polarities don't make a lot of sense when you look at them closely. but we hold on to them. They're very familiar. Okay, so now what is non-duality? We've gone through duality from many different angles, but non-duality is when all of these categories lose their potency. They don't disappear, but we're no longer a slave to the content of the categories and the categories themselves. We still live in the same world that we've always lived in, but with a different orientation. We're no longer fabricating the world. We perceive it as it is, whether relative or absolute. The labels become obsolete. In the Yogacara school of Buddhism, we might say that everything is mind. Mind is perceiving mind. This might sound esoteric, mystical, distant, foreign, unrealistic, unreachable. And when we talk about the state of a Buddha or a great Bodhisattva, it may sound like this is another class of being entirely, a society, intelligence that is far beyond us. But this is not so. And this is a central message of Buddhism and the Lotus Sutra. According to the Sutra, we are all incipient Buddhas, destined for Buddhahood. In truth, no different from Shakyamuni. Not that we don't feel like this on a bad hair day, obviously. So now looking into the world of non-duality, where actually do we look? Question is, why don't we see things this way? Why don't we see, it's called Bhuta Tata, the absolute true reality, that's in Sanskrit. According to Chan teachings, we have all the answers. We just haven't arrived at the right questions yet. That's actually not quite a Chan teaching, it's sort of my spin on it. Anyway, continuing with non-duality, it's very hard to talk about them. We say the world apple, and according to intersubjectivity, social conventions, we can find something to match it. We can even eat it. Good luck in finding a picture of non-duality. It's not a thing, nor is it a process. Like emptiness, it's indescribable, not approachable, and nothing you can distance yourself from. And I know I just threw that teaching of emptiness sort of out of left field. Once again, another very important concept, but it's really very much what we're talking about when we talk about non-duality. But emptiness is the idea that that things are not what we label. Things don't label themselves. We label them, and we label ourselves. What we really are, what things really are, is something that we don't see because of all of this distortion, not just in labeling, but in our very senses, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. There is a lot of distortion, of grasping, of attachment. So we get caught up in our own story. So, but nothing, according to the teaching of non-duality, is really outside of our awareness, This is why there's an understanding in Zen that anything you say is wrong, especially if you're discussing non-duality. There's also an understanding, we talk about ignorance in Buddhism as one of the things that blinds us to what I've been talking about. And one understanding of ignorance is that it is conceptuality itself. Not that conceptuality can't help us, it obviously can. But one thing about speaking about these things is it may be inaccurate, but we can say things that are useful and helpful and things that may point us in the right direction. So non-duality sounds very esoteric and out of the way concept, not for ordinary people. And yes, it is sometimes almost a synonym for enlightenment or the enlightened state. But it really is one way to reference the real world that everybody lives in, but which we all tend to ignore. Here's a simple illustrative story. So there is a Zen master who sees some of his students arguing, 2 students. And he goes over, calms them down, and he asks what the issue is. The first student explains his point of view. And the master looks at him and says, "You're right." And the second student then says, wait a second. And he says his X, Y, Z, and the master looks at him and says, you're right. And then the first student says, well, wait a second. We can't both be right. And the master says, you're right. So this is the wide view of not getting caught up in concepts, not taking sides. So this is not a new teaching, this non-duality. It actually is pointed to even in the Buddha's first sermon when he talks about the middle way. And middle way being not pursuing pleasure or pain. You're not great sensuality nor horrible austerities, starving yourself. And people hear this middle way and they think it's about moderation in all things, which is some very small part of it. But it's really about not attaching to any extremes or the middle. The middle is in the periphery. The periphery is in the middle. We're beyond categories. So the middle way points to this. So this is a very important teaching. And you might ask, if we're talking about non-duality, why don't we just say everythingness or oneness, which would, because the labels really don't work, there'd be nothing wrong with that. But non-duality doesn't give you much to hold on. And I just want to mention, I think time is getting a little short, but I just want to mention that if anyone is really interested in non-duality, there is a poem called Faith in Mind, and Master Sheng Yen has a book on that. And that is like the handbook, where it says to be in oneness and equality, confusion vanishes of itself. And later it says, only stagnating in duality, how can you recognize oneness? And the duality of all things issues from false discriminations, a dream, an illusion. How could they be worth grasping? And it says, only refer to not to. In not to, all things are in unity. So we're really throwing out categories entirely. And I just want to mention how non-duality, you won't find it, I think, quite the way it is in Buddhism anywhere else, but you do encounter it in Western teachings. I want to briefly mention 17th century courtier poet Richard Lovelace, who wrote, "Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage." He's talking about having freedom in love, but he's leaping out of categories, actually physical realities. He was in prison. So there is, a budding awareness of these kind of things. Marianne Moore, a 20th century American poet, talked about poetry as being something that will really grasp things as they are. And so she says, when we have true poetry, we will have imaginary gardens with real toads in them. Once again, dissolving our categories, even in a Western context. And the Inuit have a word for a storyteller, which is the one who creates an environment in which the truth is revealed. And that's what happens in the Lotus Sutra with its parables. The world is revealed in a way that is a story. It's a lie, but it's revealing the truth behind it. And probably a good way to finish this talk, I'm going to talk about the sutra a lot more next week, but I think a very good way to end is with a quote from the the late sage, the Vedanta master who died in 1981, Sri Nisargadatta. And this is a really wonderful statement about non-duality. He said, wisdom says that I am nothing. Love says that I am everything. And between these two, my life flows. So I want to thank everybody for listening and coming to visit in cyberspace, and perhaps we have some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry. That's a great talk. Now we still have some time left for questions, so feel free to raise your hand and ask your questions away. Oh, I see Simon raised his hand. Yep.
Hi, Simon.
Hey, Mr. Biller, thank you again for the conversation. Very interesting. I had a question on the theme of duality again, and I thought about compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I take that, you know, the end game of all this is compassion. Like that's kind of what we're striving for. But when you're talking about duality, kind of going in and out of the themes, I thought about, well, isn't that sort of a dualistic, I guess, striving too, as well? It's like if compassion is sort of the end game, then isn't that sort of dualistic? So can't we just sit with no compassion and compassion? I guess, I don't know, that's the question. Like, I understand that like the right view is if you sort of really understand impermanence, emptiness, no self, you're left with compassion. But at the same time, I feel like there's an element of striving, you know?
Right. Well, here's the thing about compassion. I once gave a whole talk on it, and I as I announced when I spoke about it at that time, I spoke about it because I didn't understand it. I have a much better grasp of it now. Compassion is really not to be confused with some emotion of pity or sympathy. Yes, there's an empathetic component to it, but compassion and wisdom in Buddhism are considered to be one and the same thing. Compassion is, wisdom is our perfect, clear understanding of the world as we see it ourselves. Compassion is how we deal with the world. Once we've transcended a sense of self, there's no one holding us back. I'm not saying I'm in this particular state, but the Buddha certainly is. Once that is reached, then compassion simply flows. It's like Dogen Zenji once said this: compassion comes as naturally as adjusting your pillow in the middle of the night. You just reach back without thinking, without conceptualizing, without making effort, without making no effort. It's just something that you do. And non-duality is going to open that sort of thing up. You know, when we see what's really behind all this. If there is indeed something behind, this is for us to figure out in our practice, just really what is going on. So.
Okay, thank you. So I think what I understood was that compassion isn't necessarily like a moral code that you try to I guess like that's the natural state of things once you get to the right. It's just that sort of it's just that's what it is, and once we have that right understanding, naturally we're in a state of compassion.
Yeah, I think that's true. We certainly resist it, but that I think is the teaching of compassion and wisdom, one and the same.
Okay, thank you very much.
And yeah, sure.
Cool. Anyone else? I think we may still have time for last question.
Oh, there's someone raised their hand.
Yes, Beth. Mm-hmm. Beth and Ian. Yeah,
There
go
we
ahead.
Okay.
Mhm.
So I think along the same lines of that previous question, I want to understand how morality fits into that. When I think about when I first became a Buddhist and I vowed not to lie or steal or kill or, you know, engage in sexual misconduct, to me that's morality. And different cultures, and I know that morality is not fixed because different cultures have different moral precepts.
Right.
So I know that morality, I think that there's a duality to morality. But I also know that as a Buddhist, I've vowed to follow certain moral principles. So how does that fit into non-duality?
Well, one teacher said that the precepts, which you're talking about, morality, is like how we understand and express the Dharma in the world. And the precepts, the more that you're talking about, are understood as guidelines that we try to adhere to as best we can, because there is an understanding that we're not perfect. Right? We wouldn't need precepts or anything if our actions were always perfectly moral. And the duality is something that, yes, different cultures are so different in what they think sexual misconduct is, treating other beings, killing, eating meat. There's a whole gamut of things, and we're often products of our culture. And what we find is that when you do things that are harmful to yourself or to other people, it creates unwholesome states of mind, right? It's a formula for suffering. So by adhering to these things, first, I mean, maybe we don't understand them, or maybe we don't feel like it, but we have a deep understanding of the inherent goodness of the teaching. So there is a great benefit there. And then once we are clearer, and then we just don't want to harm other people or ourselves, then I think all of this falls in line. But it is a difficult question. It's something everyone has to figure out for themselves, how moral a person they want to be, how much they want to contribute to the world, how much they want to stay within themselves. You know, we're all different. And the Lotus Sutra has, you know, I haven't gotten to it, but in the 5th chapter, it talks about how the Dharma is available to everyone in whatever stage they happen to be, moral or amoral. You know, we're all striving. I think we have time for maybe one more.
Yeah, Ian, I think.
Yeah.
Is
Oh, you got to unmute, Ian.
yeah, okay. Ian Scott.
He's manifested twice.
Do I have the power to unmute him? Let's see.
He needs to unmute himself.
Ah,
Hi, Ian. Can you just unmute yourself?
yeah, I think he
You
did.
can ask your question. Okay.
Well, I'm clicking on mute, so am I here?
Yeah.
Okay, Harry, how are you?
Good, good.
The earlier in the talk, I think you were saying something about the eradication of racism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was, in my mind, it was hearkening back to an earlier attempt to eradicate. I remember the war on drugs with Richard Nixon in the 70s. And I wondered if the attempt to eradicate or go to war against something actually feeds it, makes it stronger. The attempt to remove something or destroy it feeds it. And I think this is kind of feeding back into the current situation that we're all sinking into. I've been here 20 years and I've seen the attempt to eradicate this leading to a kind of growing force that seems to be lacking any spiritual dimension. I wondered if you had any considered thoughts about this from a Buddhist viewpoint. How can we bring a less critical and judgmental psychology or spirituality to the current setup, which is very partisan? One is forced to be either one or the other, and life is not like that.
Right, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, we especially when we fall back on righteousness and we demonize the other person. I mean, of course, in the war on drugs, which you mentioned, that's, you know, talk about dualism. Like, you know, we're wonderful and these other people are just retrobates.
Yes.
You know, it's horrible. And the idea of non-duality, and also, of course, absolutely married to that, the same concept is the Buddhist teaching of not self, of going beyond our, you know, our little mundane concerns, widening to the world, and not personally having anything to gain in our actions. We are, you know, flowing along, as I said, open and relaxed, and able to do, you know, according to our particular limitations. And you just reminded me, there's a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn about how it says, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could take all of the evil people in the world and somehow take them somewhere and destroy them? But he said, yeah. funny concept, but good and evil run through the heart of every man and woman, and said, who among us is willing to destroy a piece of their own heart?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a complicated thing. I mean, if I had some perfect formula for this, I would have patented it a long time ago. It's, you know, when we're talking about this, we're talking about a real spiritual struggle, you know, and we take, you know, sometimes one step forward, 2 steps back, sometimes 2 steps forward, but eventually we, you know, we'll reach a point, and the Lotus Sutra talks about this a lot about not backsliding.
Yes.
But we really, I mean, one just important message, and I think we're going to have to be closing soon, is really not to be judgmental of ourselves or others, to give ourselves and the world a big break. We're all in this together. We can't say the whole is on your side of the boat, not on mine, because it's the same boat.
Yes.
We really have to recognize that.
That's a beautiful finale, Hari. Thank you. That's really, I think that's been really useful. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, my friend.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Take care.